Ladies and gentlemen, in the annals of culture, where cognition and controversy collide, we find ourselves entranced by a spectacle, Trump vs. Harvard. This is no mere quarrel of politics, but a cognitive dissonance, an epistemological schism between populist intuition and institutional rationality. Trump embodies heuristics, fast, frugal, and often flawed. Harvard champions slow deliberation, Bayesian rigor, peer-reviewed prudence. The former trusts the gut, the latter demands data. This clash is not personal. It's paradigmatic. A nation split not by walls or wealth, but by what it means to know. Intuition versus rational analysis is a cognitive conflict as old as thought itself, one that has shaped how individuals and societies navigate complexity. Intuition is immediate, automatic, emotionally charged. It's the whisper of experience and instinct, fast and effortless. Rational analysis, by contrast, is deliberate, computational, slow. It requires effort, abstraction, and a certain tolerance for uncertainty. These modes of thinking are not merely styles of thought. They are underlying architectures of human cognition. Their clash, especially in the arena of public discourse, reveals a fundamental tension between how we feel truth and how we reason about it. When Donald Trump speaks, he does not offer detailed arguments or statistical models. He signals, simplifies, and repeats. His communication is evocative rather than analytical. He speaks in narratives and symbols, often bypassing the machinery of logic entirely. This is not accidental. It is intuitive. It resonates with the psychological biases and heuristics that have evolved to help humans make decisions under uncertainty, often without the luxury of data or time. Contrast this with the ethos of Harvard, a metonym for the scientific method, critical thinking, peer review, and intellectual rigor. At institutions like Harvard, knowledge is constructed, not conjured. Claims must be justified, methods scrutinized, counterarguments anticipated. Rational analysis governs the production of truth. One must be trained, mentored, corrected. This method is effortful and slow, but it aspires to objectivity. The cognitive scientist Daniel Kahneman famously described two systems of thought: System 1, fast and intuitive; System 2, slow and rational. Trump, wittingly or not, operates through System 1. He taps into emotion, gut-level reactions, pattern recognition. System 1 is prone to biases, confirmation bias, availability heuristics, effective forecasting, but it is powerful. It's the reason slogans work better than white papers. It's why storytelling eclipses statistical reasoning in public persuasion. Harvard, in contrast, is a temple of System 2. Here, knowledge production is structured to minimize error. Arguments must be falsifiable, evidence replicable. Rational analysis isn't just a preference, it's a discipline. Yet this rigor can alienate. It can feel cold, inaccessible, even arrogant. For those outside the academy, it often lacks the visceral force of lived experience or common sense. And therein lies the tension. This divide plays out not only in political rhetoric, but in how people relate to expertise itself. Intuition respects personal experience. What one sees, hears, feels directly. Rational analysis requires deference to aggregated data, to models, to people who've spent years studying a subject. Trump channels the former, Harvard demands the latter. But people do not always want to be told what they don't know. In fact, many resent it. This friction is magnified in moments of crisis. Consider a pandemic. The scientific approach demands models, data, and probabilistic forecasts. But humans are not Bayesian calculators. They crave certainty, heroes, and villains. Trump gave them that. Masks work, masks don't. He didn't wait for studies, he declared. Harvard-affiliated scientists, on the other hand, revised their models, admitted uncertainty, hedged their claims. Rational analysis reflects the complexity of reality, but at a psychological cost. It feels indecisive. Intuition feels strong. The media ecosystem further intensifies the split. Intuitive content spreads faster. A single viral anecdote can overwhelm years of empirical research. Emotive language outpaces analytic caution. Rational analysis requires context. Intuition thrives on punchlines. Trump's talent lies in exploiting this asymmetry. He speaks in fragments that resonate with System 20. Fake news. Witch hunt. Make America great again. These phrases bypass critical analysis and strike at identity, emotion, tribe. Harvard, meanwhile, produces white papers and policy briefs. One reaches hearts, the other aims for minds. But to frame this as a battle between ignorance and enlightenment is itself an intellectual failure. Intuition is not inferior to rationality. It is foundational. Evolutionarily, it is older, faster, and often sufficient. It is what allowed our ancestors to survive before science existed. It governs social judgments, moral decisions, and threat detection. Rational analysis, while powerful, is costly. It demands time, education, and mental energy. In the real world, people don't always have those resources, so intuition isn't a flaw, it's a feature. What becomes dangerous is when one side dismisses the other. When intuition refuses to admit error, it calcifies into dogma. When rational analysis ignores emotion and narrative, it becomes irrelevant. Trump's appeal is not simply to ignorance, but to a mode of cognition that values certainty, clarity, and speed. Harvard's appeal is to those willing to grapple with ambiguity, trade-offs, and delayed gratification. These are not just political divides, they are neurocognitive ones. In education, this divide poses challenges. How do you teach people to value rational analysis when their intuitions are so deeply rewarded by society and media? Can you train someone to override their gut? Cognitive science says yes, but only with effort and feedback. Yet our institutions often fail to provide either. In a democracy where persuasion is paramount, the dominance of intuition may shape policy more than any academic insight ever could. The implications extend beyond politics. In law, medicine, economics, intuition and rationality battle for dominance. A judge may feel someone is guilty despite evidence. A doctor may rely on instinct instead of the latest trial. Intuition is fast and sometimes right. But rational analysis provides a safeguard, a structure to minimize error. When these systems conflict, society must decide which to trust. Trump vs. Harvard is not about a man versus a school. It is about how we weigh truth. Intuition tells us what feels right. Rationality tells us what is right, sometimes in spite of ourselves. Yet, the more complex the world becomes, the more we may lean on intuition just to survive its noise. That is the paradox. The tools we need most, careful reasoning, data literacy, skepticism, are the very tools that feel most unnatural in a world that rewards speed and certainty. Populism versus academic elitism is not merely a political rivalry. It is a confrontation between two distinct worldviews, one grounded in the authority of common experience, the other in the legitimacy of institutional knowledge. Populism appeals to the masses by validating everyday intuition, shared grievance, and cultural identity. Academic elitism, on the other hand, derives its influence from expertise, credentialed reasoning, and systematic inquiry. The former claims authenticity, the latter claims accuracy. When these two collide, as they have in the figure of Donald Trump versus the intellectual ethos of Harvard, it is not simply a disagreement over facts, but a rupture in how truth itself is produced and perceived. Populism speaks in the language of "wa," the people, the forgotten, the real Americans. It constructs an "against them," where often includes scholars, scientists, journalists, and bureaucrats, those perceived to live in ivory towers, disconnected from the daily realities of ordinary citizens. Academic elitism, conversely, speaks in the language of precision, qualifications, and methods. It demands that claims be supported by evidence, that theories be subjected to scrutiny, and that certainty be tempered by doubt. This contrast in tone and posture is not incidental. It reflects two fundamentally different kinds of epistemic authority. Donald Trump does not cite peer-reviewed studies or make appeals to institutional consensus. He speaks with absolute certainty, not because he has verified the facts, but because confidence itself is persuasive. He offers a kind of intuitive clarity that resonates with people who feel that traditional institutions have failed them. Harvard and its peer institutions, by contrast, embrace a form of guarded truth that is always provisional, always subject to further inquiry. Yet that very caution can sound like equivocation to an audience hungry for decisive answers. In this way, populism thrives where academic elitism falters. It simplifies what is complex and personalizes what is abstract. The academic elite is trained to disaggregate problems, to think in terms of causal mechanisms, statistical probabilities, and long-term trends. Populist rhetoric compresses these into narratives of betrayal and redemption. A trade policy isn't a result of multivariate pressures and geopolitical dynamics. It's a bad deal. A pandemic isn't a function of viral mutation and transmission rates. It's a hoax or a lab leak. The populist mind prefers agency over accident, intention over randomness. Elites, however, are trained to resist such simplifications. This resistance to narrative closure makes academic voices appear aloof, even suspicious, in the populist imagination. This divide is further sharpened by the differing conceptions of merit. In elite academic circles, merit is defined by intellectual achievement, publication, peer recognition, and mastery of abstract knowledge. In populist ideology, merit is redefined as resilience, patriotism, authenticity, and practical wisdom. A factory worker who has weathered economic upheaval is viewed as more morally legitimate than a tenured professor who writes about globalization from the safety of Cambridge. Populism thus reverses the polarity of status. What academia valorizes as elite qualifications, populism recasts as elitist disconnection. This tension also plays out linguistically. Academics are trained to hedge. The data suggest, preliminary findings indicate, We hypothesize populist language is declarative, emotive, and unqualified. This is wrong. They lied. I alone can fix it. The academic voice, filtered through layers of caveat and context, can feel sanitized and depersonalized. Populism, by contrast, offers emotional immediacy. It invites the listener to feel, not just think. And in a media landscape driven by sound bites, the populist mode often dominates. The clash between Trump and Harvard is not just symbolic. It is structural. Harvard represents a meritocratic system that filters individuals through standardized tests, research output, and intellectual networks. Trump represents an anti-system, someone who succeeded by rejecting those filters, appealing instead to media spectacle, emotional resonance, and populist theater. His rise to power bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge and credibility, and this bypassing was precisely the point. For many of his supporters, Trump's lack of elite polish is not a flaw but a credential in itself, a mark of authenticity in a world they view as ruled by credentialed imposters. This dynamic has global parallels. The populist backlash against academic elitism is not confined to the United States. Across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, similar figures have emerged, leaders who decry universities as bastions of liberal indoctrination and paint intellectuals as enemies of the people. This suggests that the populism-elitism divide is not purely ideological, but deeply psychological and sociological. It reflects anxiety about status, identity, and the changing nature of authority in a knowledge economy. Part of the appeal of populism is its promise to flatten hierarchies. In an academic context, knowledge is hierarchical. There are theories, there is evidence, and there are rules for how claims are evaluated. Populism, in contrast, collapses those distinctions. Everyone's opinion is equally valid, feelings trump facts. This democratization of knowledge can be empowering, but it also opens the door to conspiracy, misinformation, and a distrust of expertise. Trump's dismissal of scientific consensus on climate change, his attacks on epidemiologists during COVID-19, and his general disdain for journalists and scholars are not random provocations. They are central to a populist strategy that seeks to delegitimize any epistemic authority that challenges his narrative. This presents a profound dilemma for academic elites. If they respond with disdain, they reinforce the populist narrative of arrogance. If they retreat into silence, they surrender the terrain of public discourse. Engaging with populism on its own rhetorical terms is intellectually dangerous, yet insisting on the slow deliberations of scholarly method can feel out of step with a fast-paced, polarized society. Thus, the conflict becomes not just political but epistemological, a battle over what counts as knowledge, who gets to produce it, and how it is communicated. The educational system lies at the heart of this divide. Academic elites often advocate for critical thinking, media literacy, and the importance of STEM disciplines. But these values may not be experienced as liberating by those who feel alienated by the institutions that promote them. If the path to elite status is perceived as exclusionary, inaccessible, or irrelevant to daily life, then populism's appeal will only grow. The challenge, then, is not just to defend expertise, but to democratize access to it without diluting its rigor. At its core, the tension between populism and academic elitism reflects a deep uncertainty about how society defines legitimacy. Is it the lived experience of the many, or the analytical distance of the few? Is authority earned through struggle or through study? Can a society both respect the instincts of the populace and the insights of the academy? These questions do not have simple answers, but they structure the cultural moment in which we find ourselves. The epistemological divide that characterizes the tension between Trump and Harvard is more than a disagreement over politics or culture. It is a conflict over how truth is defined, validated, and transmitted. It reaches into the foundations of how individuals form beliefs, how societies construct knowledge, and how authority is assigned in an age where information is both ubiquitous and unstable. This divide reflects two radically different orientations toward the nature of knowing, one grounded in intuition, immediacy, and identity, the other anchored in critical inquiry, methodological discipline, and institutional validation. Trump's rhetoric and behavior consistently demonstrate a particular epistemology, one that treats truth as performative rather than propositional. In this view, a claim becomes true, not because it corresponds to reality or survives scrutiny, but because it is stated with confidence, repeated with frequency, and affirmed by one's community. Truth is what resonates, not what withstands falsification. For Trump and many of his followers, statements gain legitimacy not from data, but from their alignment with a shared worldview. When he calls the media fake news or dismisses climate change as a hoax, he is not offering counter-evidence. He is performing a kind of epistemic solidarity. He is signaling that the traditional arbiters of truth, Scientists, journalists, professors are no longer trusted, that their claims are tainted by ideology or elitism. Harvard, as a symbol of elite academic institutions, embodies the opposing epistemology. Here, truth is not a product of resonance or repetition, but of justification. Claims must be tested, evidence must be scrutinized, and theories must be revised in light of new findings. The scientific method, peer review, and interdisciplinary critique are tools designed to insulate knowledge from bias and error. This epistemology is slow, often tentative, and always provisional. It demands that individuals suspend personal conviction in favor of empirical evaluation. This approach is more stable, but less emotionally compelling. It lacks the certainty and simplicity that populist rhetoric provides, which makes it vulnerable in the marketplace of persuasion. The epistemological divide also maps onto differing attitudes toward authority. Trump's epistemology is vertical but personal. Truth is what the leader says it is, backed by charisma and loyalty. Harvard's epistemology is horizontal and procedural. Truth is what survives methodical inquiry, regardless of who proposes it. This means that in the academic world, even the most eminent scholar can be wrong, and even a novice can be right if the evidence supports them. In the populist frame, such proceduralism can feel like evasion, a refusal to speak plainly or commit to a firm position. It can seem like cowardice masquerading as nuance. The role of emotion in knowledge formation further deepens the divide. Populist epistemology is rooted in affect. Beliefs are not just held, they are felt. They are entangled with identity, belonging, and moral clarity. This makes them resilient to counterargument because to abandon a belief is to risk social and psychological dislocation. Academic epistemology, in contrast, demands emotional detachment. It asks thinkers to bracket their feelings, to tolerate ambiguity, and to be open to being wrong. This cognitive posture is difficult to cultivate and often comes at the cost of immediacy and conviction. Yet it is precisely this detachment that makes academic knowledge more reliable over time. The digital age intensifies the epistemological divide. The internet has democratized information but not discernment. In theory, anyone can access high-quality research. In practice, people gravitate towards sources that confirm their priors and flatter their identity. Algorithms reward emotional intensity, not factual accuracy. This environment favors the populist epistemology. A viral tweet can overshadow a decade of peer-reviewed work. A conspiracy theory with narrative coherence can outcompete a complex truth with probabilistic caveats. Trump has mastered this terrain. He knows that in an attention economy, salience beats substance. Harvard, by contrast, still operates in a knowledge economy that values depth, rigor, and citation. These two epistemologies are calibrated to different incentive structures and thus rarely meet on equal footing. Education plays a central role in shaping epistemologies. Academic institutions train students not just in content but in how to think, how to assess sources, weigh arguments, and entertain counterfactuals. This is epistemological training. Yet this training is often unevenly distributed. Many Americans never attend institutions like Harvard and are never taught the difference between anecdote and data or between opinion and analysis. This creates a structural gap in epistemic habits, which then becomes a political fault line. When elites speak in the language of uncertainty and probability, they are often misunderstood as being evasive or untrustworthy. When populist leaders speak in absolutes, they are seen as strong and decisive, even if their claims are demonstrably false. The epistemological divide also manifests in differing standards of proof. For the academic elite, no claim is above scrutiny. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. For populist movements, proof is often secondary to narrative fit. If a claim reinforces a shared sense of grievance or aligns with a perceived injustice, it is more likely to be accepted. The idea that millions of votes were stolen in an election, or that public health measures are part of a sinister plot, persists not because of compelling evidence, but because these claims align with a worldview that feels coherent and morally justified. Rational rebuttals often fail, not because they lack logic, but because they lack emotional resonance. This divide has real consequences for policy, governance, and civic discourse. When a society cannot agree on the basic standards for what counts as a fact, collective decision-making becomes paralyzed. Political polarization is exacerbated by epistemic polarization. Each side not only has different opinions, but different ways of forming opinions. In this environment, dialogue becomes impossible because the very foundations of knowledge are contested. Trump vs. Harvard is thus not just a battle over prestige or ideology. It is a battle over the cognitive architecture of society. The epistemological divide also impacts how people relate to the future. Academic reasoning is forward-looking, grounded in models and projections. It accepts uncertainty as a feature of the world and designs systems to manage risk. Populist reasoning is often retrospective. It draws on nostalgia, on a mythologized past, and seeks clarity through restoration. Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," is epistemologically backward-looking. It suggests that the truth has already been known and must be reclaimed, not discovered anew. Academic institutions, by contrast, seek to generate new knowledge, often at the cost of discomfort and change. Trust is the final axis of the epistemological divide. In academic culture, trust is placed in systems, journals, institutions, protocols. In populist culture, trust is personal. It is given to individuals, to insiders, to those who seem relatable. This is why a single YouTube video from a self-styled expert can carry more weight than a consensus document from a professional society. The populist audience does not trust the system because they do not feel seen by it. Harvard as a system represents rules, gatekeeping, and exclusion to many people. Trump as a person represents voice, rebellion, and identification. This asymmetry in trust structures reinforces the epistemological divide and ensures that it will not be resolved simply by providing more data or better arguments. The authority of experience versus the authority of evidence represents one of the deepest and most persistent divisions in the landscape of human reasoning. On one side stands the authority derived from lived reality, the things seen, felt, endured, and interpreted by individuals in the course of their everyday lives. This authority is rooted in memory, testimony, and direct perception. On the other side lies the authority of evidence, quantified, tested, replicated, and abstracted from personal circumstance. This authority emerges from structured inquiry, collective validation, and dispassionate measurement. In the context of Trump versus Harvard, this dichotomy becomes not just an epistemic contrast, but a cultural and political schism. Donald Trump, throughout his political career, has repeatedly drawn upon the legitimacy of personal experience. He foregrounds anecdote, gut instinct, and narrative realism. His speeches are saturated with references to what people are saying, what I've seen, or what everyone knows. He speaks to and for individuals who believe that their direct experience of the world should not be discounted or disqualified by data they did not generate or experts they do not trust. In this worldview, the testimony of the farmer, the worker, or the small business owner carries more weight than the regression analysis of an economist or the peer-reviewed article of a sociologist. Trump's genius lies in recognizing that millions of people feel unseen and unheard by institutions that speak in the language of aggregate data and probability distributions. Harvard, by contrast, embodies the authority of evidence. Its scholars are trained to question personal impressions, to control for bias, and to interpret individual stories within broader statistical frameworks. The evidence they produce is not drawn from singular events, but from patterns observed across large data sets, from experiments designed to eliminate confounding variables, and from models that generalize beyond the idiosyncrasies of any one life. In this intellectual tradition, the plural of anecdote is not data, experience is meaningful, but it must be situated, scrutinized, and often discounted if it contradicts broader empirical trends. The authority of evidence demands abstraction. It asks its practitioners to rise above the immediacy of their own lives and to look at the world from the vantage point of structure, trend, and cause. This divergence has moral and emotional dimensions. People do not simply hold on to their experiences, they are shaped by them. When someone has lost a job to automation, or watched their community struggle with addiction, or experienced violence or economic insecurity, those events leave a cognitive and emotional imprint. They are not hypothetical variables. They are realities that demand recognition. When these experiences are met with statistics that seem to negate or relativize them, resentment can grow. It is not just that the evidence contradicts their beliefs, it is that it appears to erase their reality. In this context, Trump's refusal to defer to expert consensus reads as a form of epistemic justice. He validates the authority of experience in a way that institutions like Harvard often fail to do. Academic institutions, by necessity, rely on methods that attempt to eliminate subjectivity. This is their strength and their weakness. It allows them to discover truths that are not visible to the naked eye, to distinguish signal from noise, and to avoid being misled by personal bias. But in doing so, they can appear detached from the human consequences of their findings. A policy recommendation based on randomized controlled trials may be statistically optimal and still feel morally or culturally alien to those who must live with its consequences. The authority of evidence can become alienating if it lacks mechanisms for integrating the voices of those whose lives are being measured. This divide becomes especially salient in times of crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, For instance, public health officials issued guidelines based on evolving data and changing models. These guidelines were the product of rigorous analysis, but they often clashed with people's lived experience. When someone in a small rural town with no immediate outbreak was told to wear a mask or shut down their business, the advice felt disconnected from their reality. Trump seized on this gap. He cast the recommendations not as protective measures grounded in evidence, but as overreaches imposed by distant elites. By appealing to what people saw in their own communities, rather than what epidemiologists projected on national charts, he reinforced the authority of experience over that of evidence. Media further amplifies this tension. News outlets that prioritize anecdote and emotion often outperform those that foreground data and nuance. A single story of vaccine injury can generate more outrage than 1,000 successful immunizations. A viral video of a person confronting a school board can shape opinion more strongly than a meta-analysis of educational outcomes. Trump understands this instinctively. He uses stories as rhetorical weapons, often leaving fact-checkers scrambling to catch up. Harvard-trained thinkers tend to respond with corrections, data sets, and methodological critiques. But these tools, while intellectually superior, are often rhetorically inert. They lack the emotional resonance of lived testimony. The educational divide exacerbates the authority gap. Those who have spent years immersed in academic environments learn to distrust immediate impressions. They are trained to look for confirmation bias, to demand controls, to distinguish correlation from causation. Those outside these environments may find such habits of mind alien or even condescending. The gap is not just one of knowledge, but of cognitive style. Harvard represents an epistemic culture that rewards detachment, while Trump represents one that rewards assertion. One prizes accuracy, the other authenticity. The tension between them is not reducible to who is right, but to what counts as a legitimate basis for belief. There is also a historical dimension to the divide. For centuries, the authority of experience was the default. People trusted what they saw and heard, what their communities taught them, what their elders handed down. The scientific revolution and the rise of modern institutions changed that. They introduced new ways of knowing, ways that often contradicted common sense. The Earth orbits the sun, not vice versa. Germs cause disease, even if you can't see them. Bias infects memory, even when you are sure you are right. These insights required the dethroning of experience as the final arbiter of truth. But for many, that dethroning still feels illegitimate. It feels like erasure. Trump taps into this sense of epistemic grievance. He offers people back their voice, not through deliberation or verification, but through repetition and affirmation. He tells them that their experiences matter more than models, that their intuitions matter more than charts. Harvard, meanwhile, continues to defend a vision of truth that insists on skepticism, on deferral, on complexity. It upholds the authority of evidence not because it is elitist, but because it is fallible and seeks ways to guard against its own fallibility. This tension is unlikely to be resolved by persuasion alone. It is not just a matter of providing more data or telling better stories. It is a structural conflict between different ways of relating to reality. One is horizontal, distributed across individual lives, shaped by memory and emotion. The other is vertical, built through institutions, peer review, and dispassionate scrutiny. Each has its strengths and its liabilities. The challenge is not to eliminate either, but to find ways of navigating between them. Ways that acknowledge the dignity of experience without sacrificing the rigor of evidence.